functional theory studies of various phthalocyanine materials. So Dan is the winner of a Ronald Suter Prize. He attended an international summer school on computational many-body theory in Sherbrooke, Quebec. He was a summer researcher at Pacific Northwest National Lab, so he's kept himself pretty busy. And so this is the culmination of his master's work. And so I'll turn it over to Professor Lee, the chairperson, to tell you how this is going to go.
So hopefully, most of you don't know me. I'm Johnny Lee. I just started as assistant professor in the chemistry department. By training, I'm a computational chemist. That's why I'm here in the committee. And okay, let's talk about some formal thing. So I believe the whole presentation session should be 45 minutes. And I'll keep track of the time, and I will give you a signal when there's 45 minutes left. And after the presentation, we'll have no more than half an hour question session for the public. So please prepare your question. And after public session, I will ask a non-committee member to leave, and we'll have a private discussion about work. Okay? Please.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you very much, Professor Lee, Professor Maestro, for the introduction. All right, so I'm going to be talking about my work here for the past 3 years. It's work on these phthalocyanine materials. I just want to point out right away, sort of a nomenclature point to make. I do sort of give all of my abstracts, titles, everything up to this point has been dilute. CuPcs has been brought to my attention recently that dilute might not be the appropriate word for these. That might be better to talk about organic alloys. So just note that when I talk about dilute CuPcs, I go through it and define it, so just bear with me for that. Alright, so when we want to look at phthalocyanines in particular. So phthalocyanines, they've been known for many, many years, many decades. And so they're well studied in the molecular form, they're well studied in crystalline or thin film forms. So what makes these even more interesting to study from the theory? Why would we need to do that? So what I'm showing here on the right hand from this slide here is the photoelectron spectra for different transition metal-phthalocyanines. And what these arrows point out are the energy levels of these d orbitals from the transition metals. So what we can see is that throughout this whole series of transition metal-phthalocyanines, these d orbitals, they change in energy with respect to the highest energy states for these systems. And in particular, we have even the orbital ordering, such as a manganese phthalocyanine, where this arrow indicates that the d orbital actually changes to the other side of this feature right here. And I'll get into that a little bit later, but this is more of an impetus to why I want to study phthalocyanines and look at these dilute samples. Because when we have these dilute samples, we can start to change this ordering and sort of get different interactions between the d orbitals of adjacent phthalocyanines. So in the outline of my talk, what I'm going to start with is a little bit of introduction and theory behind phthalocyanines and what I did. So mainly just go through density functional theory, that's what I used to study these, and the various approximations that I had to make along the way so that I could adequately describe these systems. I'll present the computational details fairly quickly, just to give you an overview of what I did. And then I'll dive right into the results. Where the results follow the structure of, I'll look at the structural optimization, where I start from the molecular form and move on to the 1D crystals. I'll explain a little bit about that later. And then I move into the Hubbard U and the exchange constants that I'm using in these the models and approximations that I'm using. And then get into the electronic structure of these. So just to tie it all back together to these plots right here. So just keep in mind that what I'm looking at here is for this d orbital shifts in these dilute samples, or just some interaction between them. And that's what will be shown through UPS and density of states. Alright. So what is a phthalocyanine? Well, phthalocyanines, they've been used as industrial pigments for a very long time, for over 100 years actually. And you can see from right here we have copper phthalocyanine, and here we have the ultramarine color of cobalt phthalocyanine. They're very vibrant pigments. It's due to these transition metals inside the phthalocyanines. They're also used for molecular electronics. They've been looked at, or they've been looked at for the transport properties. And for organic transport, it's still fairly low. And they've also been used in photovoltaic devices, and you see here that photovoltaic sandwich on the right-hand side here, where you have a phthalocyanine, usually copper phthalocyanine paired with C60 as your donor acceptor layer. Now here in the top right-hand corner here, we have a phthalocyanine molecule. So this is what it looks like. This is from a top-down view. So we can see that it's a planar molecule, and right here in the center here is the transition metal. So when I mentioned transition metal centers, that's what I mean here. You don't always need transition metal for these phthalocyanines. You can also have the metal-free H2Pc, and that's what I'm diluting these copper phthalocyanines with. And there can be various different transition metals that span the whole periodic table. It sort of changed the structure, but for this research, looking at copper phthalocyanine, we assumed a planar structure for these. So now we can look at what is phthalocyanine in crystalline form. And that's where we really get these this 1D dynamics that I talked about a little previously. So in crystalline form, copper phthalocyanine takes two major phases, and so does H2Pc as well. We call those the alpha and beta phase. Now in this alpha and beta phase, they're distinguished by the stacking and sliding angle of these phthalocyanines. So you can imagine a planar phthalocyanine, and then you stack more phthalocyanines on top of it. Now there's obviously some rotational symmetry about these, so we can explain a sliding angle is how we would rotate these with respect to each other through the stack. And then the stacking angle is how much they're overlapping with each other. And that's shown here on the right-hand side, where we have the sliding angle on the bottom. That's in the XY plane. So we're changing that this way. And then we have the stacking angle here that's would be in the XZ plane. And it's pushing it over on the side. So this picture here on the left, it shows a profile shot of the phthalocyanine crystalline form. And this is the major motivation for looking at it in the 1D chain. Because what we find is that the interactions between different chains are fairly low. Whereas most of the interactions come from the interchain interactions. So what I'm going to be looking at through these systems is this 1D chain. And we're going to call it a pseudo 1D approximation for these systems. So now that we've understood a little bit about the structure of the phthalocyanines, what I'm going to be looking at here, these 1D chains, let's look at a little bit of the electronic structure. And this sort of goes back to the introduction. And really, what are we looking for? What D states can we look for that it might be changing within these phthalocyanines? So what I have over here on the right-hand side is a picture of the calculated UPS spectra. So what that means is the ultraviolet photoelectron spectra for these. So you have some ultraviolet photons come in, they excite the electrons, and you get some reading back from them. And that's what this is showing here. It roughly, these are for gas phase, so they're molecular UPS spectra. They roughly correlate, you can correlate these to orbitals by looking at how they change or where you might see your peaks at. So what I want to point out here is this bottom picture right here, this labeled PBE. PBE denotes the type of functional used, and that's actually the type of functional that I will be using here. Go through and explain a little bit more about that later, but the important point to mention here is this line right here. So it's actually a double line, it's red and green, and it denotes the B1G and the A1U orbitals. What does that mean? Well, over here on the right-hand side, or sorry, the left-hand side here, we have the B1G orbitals, which are describing the in-plane interactions of these D electrons. And then the A1U orbitals here, which are describing what I'm calling the ligand interactions between nitrogen and copper within the phthalocyanine. Now when I mention ligand, what I'm actually referring to is the entire phthalocyanine here. And what that means is that the transition metal is within the ligand field of the phthalocyanine. So just note that for future reference, and that's what I'm referring to. So the important point to you, so these are very, very much overlapping lines, and very, very difficult to distinguish the B1G and A1U states. So if you look at with just normal PBE density functional theory, you can't quite distinguish between these states. Whereas if we look up here, what this second from the bottom denotes is a more a better functional for these. These are called hybrid functionals. It's essentially a step up on the density functional ladder. So it's a better approximation of their system. And what you get is the splitting. You can observe it very clearly between the V1G and the A1B orbitals. So how can we look? So if I'm going to be looking at it with PBE, with the slowest level approximation in this case, how can I adequately describe this system? Since we know that these should be split, but they're apparently not. So I'll get into a little bit about that later. But just note for that it's these orbitals that are very important to understand for these systems. All right. So now that I have this 1D structure, I'm looking for electronic properties in these. And I know I'm going to be using cobalt-phthalocyanine. So what do I mean when I say dilute? And I want to be looking at dilute structures for this. So here I'm presenting the organic alloys or dilute systems that I'll be using. So what I'm looking at is the 100%, 75, 50, 25, and the 0% CuPc cases. And that's how I refer to it. So when I say 100%, I mean completely CuPc. For here, we have the arrows denote spins on the copper atoms. So we can see that we end up with these copper phthalocyanines that are in different environments. And what I mean by that is we have here, if you could just imagine a 1D chain of 100% CuPc, if you chose any single copper phthalocyanine, the environment would be a copper phthalocyanine on one side and a copper phthalocyanine on the other side. Whereas if you start to see these dilute cases, the environment changes. Here you have copper phthalocyanine, here you have H2Pc. And here you would have H2Pc on one side, and if you extend it periodically, you have H2Pc on the other side. So these different environmental changes, and that's what I'm going to be looking at eventually. Now we also have to notice that if you choose a case like 50%, there can be different configurations that you could use for the copper phthalocyanine. So I just want to point this out. Now if in the 50% case here, we have this what I call the first configuration, where you have these nearest neighbor phthalocyanines, and then you have also this next nearest neighbor phthalocyanine configuration for them. Alright, so now that I've sort of outlined what systems I'm going to be studying, now how am I going to be studying these systems? And like I alluded to earlier, I'm going to be using density functional theory to understand these systems. And what density functional theory boils down to is you have first the CuPc equation, which is essentially the Schrodinger equation in the single electron approximation with this important feature here, where you have this exchange correlation potential functional here, and where you can define the eigenvalue or the energies for your system based on the CuPc eigenvalues. Where again we have this exchange correlational function. Now notice that rather than being dependent on position or anything like that, this is these are functionals of the electron density, and that's a very important approximation for density functional theory. Now, another important thing to note for these is that these are self-consistently solved. And what do I mean by self-consistently solved? And that comes back to the whole use of single particle wave functions here. So when you solve this system, what you get is if you fix all of the other, in this case, electron density in your system, and you just look at the dynamics of a single particle. You can look at those dynamics, and then you can minimize your energy with respect to how that particle will behave in the system. Now, self-consistently, these extra dynamics are brought back into play when you start to move around every single other particle in your system, such that they begin to interact with each other. And that's what the self-consistent loop is for these in density functional theory. Now, also with density functional theory, we had in that CuPc equation we had the exchange relation potential functional, as well as in the energy eigenvalue we had these energy functionals. So what this says here is that if we knew the form of our exchange relation energy functional, we could determine essentially all of the properties self-consistently for our system. We could determine it exactly, and that's in theory. In practice, it doesn't always turn out that way, and we end up having to approximate the form of these exchange relation functionals. And I just want to point out that when I say the electron density here, it's posited in electron density. So this relation here between these between the wave functions for your system and the electron density relation is given here.
So those size are
yes.
1 electron orbitals?
so these should be your total electrons. So it would be these, not super, it would be the product state of all of the single particle electrons. So these are the total system wave functions.
This wave function, depending on R, is a many electron system. What R is that?
This is some position in space. So is that sufficient for your answer?
We'll come back to it.
Okay. All right. So in theory, if we had the exact exchange correlation functional, we could exactly solve our system. Like where we have to use an approximation usually on these functionals to solve the system. Now, in understanding transition metals in DFT, you don't always, well, it's not very a good density functional theory by itself or alone is not a good method of finding all of the electronic properties for your system. So what we have to do is we have to include other models or include corrections to these energy functions. And the first correction that we're going to be making here is looking at the Hubbard model. So the Hubbard model, so the generic case of how density functional theory fails is with Mott insulators, where it predicts the Mott insulators, which should typically be an insulator, it predicts them to be metallic, or it predicts them to be conductors. So that's typically solved by using this Hubbard model approach to it. So we have to introduce some Coulomb repulsion, an on-site Coulomb repulsion. That's the term for it. So what do we see here with this Hubbard model? We have this term here on the left. That denotes the kinetic energy term of your electrons. So that's the Hawking of your electrons. So you can imagine if you had some 1D chain of sites with electrons on them, if they were half filled, you can imagine an electron moving from one site to the other, and you can describe the kinetic energy that it might have to perform that Hawking as a T. You see that T parameter here, where we're creating an electron on one site and destroying it on the previous site. And these are the accretion and annihilation operators here. We also have to take into account the fact that since there's already electrons on these sites, when that electron moves there, it's going to feel some cost and energy to want to move there due to Coulomb repulsion. We're going to use the U term here, which is given by the number of electrons that spin up and spin down on some state here. And so we can change this U to give us a way of scaling the cost and energy that an electron is going to feel. Now this comes into play when we have to look at these the 1D chains. So like I said before, so you have these 1D chains of phthalocyanines, which is a little bit approximated by this model here. And we have single electron states, so they're D9 copper on those states. So you have these single electrons, and you can imagine their interaction between the copper atoms along this chain. All right, so what is this U, and how does it connect to density function theory? So just to give a little bit of an understanding of what U is in general. So what U is like I said before, this cost and energy, and we have here this difference between our initial state, where D is just some state, and N is the occupation on that state. So we have some energy at some state with an N occupation, so we consider just two states here. And then we have the electron moves. So we're left with one state with minus one electron, and one state that you now have plus one electron. So we just have the difference in energy between these final states and the initial states, and that's what we're going to call the cost, or the energy cost, or the U value. So when we add it into our, like I said, we're going to augment our density functional to include this term here. So what we're going to do is we're going to consider the original functional that we're going to be using. We're going to add to it this Hubbard term here that's going to represent the cost of adding the due to this U. And then we have to also consider a double counting term. This double counting term comes into play that density functional theory, the functionals do consider some amount of U, but it's typically less than is required to describe these systems. So that whatever value of the U is calculated by the original functional, we have to subtract that up. Alright, so now how would we go about looking at what this U is? So what I'm going to be showing, what I'm showing here on this right-hand side, is sort of a model system to describe where this U comes from in density functional theory. And if you consider a system where you have just some state, and you are either add electrons or subtract electrons from it, you get these discrete energy steps. So that's given by this red line here, is the exact system. So we have our normal system here. We can subtract an electron, we can add an electron, we get different energies from it. And what this LDA here, that corresponds to density functional theory. So LDA is just sort of the lowest level approximation to the exchange correlation function that we can make. That represents density functional theory. So what we see here is we have this continuous change in energy between these. So we're adding in electrons. It doesn't happen in discrete steps. So how are we going to define this U for these systems, and ultimately what does it mean in terms of correcting the functions? Is we're looking at this difference between what it should be exactly and how DFT describes the system. So we have some difference here. So what we end up here is we need to correct for partially occupied states in those. And when we have these fully occupied or singly occupied, we don't really need to correct for that. So just keep that in mind. That's really the form that U takes when it goes into the exchange relation function for these. All right, and the way we can describe the U is we can look at the concavity of our energy change from the system depending on the occupation. So we can say that if these energy costs here, if it was much more concave, we have a higher value of U that we would need for these. And if it was a fairly low cost in energy, which would correspond to broad range, or broad hopping here, it would be a very low cost for this. And this Kohn-Sham term comes out from the self-consistent field equation. In terms of time, if you want to ask, if you have questions about what this Kohn-Sham term means here, you can ask me later, and I'll be happy to describe that to you. So that's what we're using for the Hubbard model in looking at the interactions between these copper atoms on the d orbitals for them. So now we want to look at the exchange. So these copper atoms, they have spin on them. We want to understand the strength of interaction of these spins. So from the Hubbard model, you can derive the Heisenberg model here. So what the Heisenberg model here, we're using it here, is to describe the strength of interaction of these spins. So you can see some ferromagnetic system here. You can imagine that there's some interaction between the spins on these. And what we're going to say is that we have SI, you consider that one of these spins, and SJ is another site spin. And in this particular case, we're using the 1D nearest neighbor Heisenberg model for it. So we're only considering nearest neighbor interactions just from this case here. And IJ is our sites. And the strength of interaction is given by this J term. And in order to figure out what, also this Heisenberg model, since I have the negative outside here, the ancient ferromagnetic term would be a negative J, and a ferromagnetic term would be a positive J, if you did calculate the J value. So how do I want to calculate the strength of interaction using DFT? Well, it turns out that looking at these J values has been done using the early 80s, mid-80s, at this process developed called Prokin symmetry, looking at, in particular, the dimer models. So now we don't have periodic systems that this Prokin symmetry is applied to, but rather finite systems. So the case of what does Prokin symmetry mean for these is that if you consider one system, it has a high spin symmetry system, then you consider the alternate antiferromagnetic or broken symmetry system here. And in terms of the DFT energies, what the Prokin symmetry model gives you back is a relation between your exchange constants here and the energies for each of these states. So Bs corresponds to Prokin symmetry state. And that should be E. EHS corresponds to the energy of the high symmetry state, where it's the S1 and S2 are the spin on the high symmetry state. In our case, since it's copper and we only have a single spin single unpaired spin that we're looking at, we consider just S1 and S2 to be just the 1/2. So what we get is a coefficient of 1 out in front of this. So our exchange constants would correspond exactly to these differences in energy. But when you're considering a dimer system, it doesn't give you all of the dynamics that you should be introducing when we're looking at these dilute systems. So if I'm looking at a 75% system and I have not just a dimer, but multiple interactions happening within there, how do you describe that sort of system? So the way that we're describing this is looking at the polynuclear extension to the broken symmetry model. So we consider here a whole range of cases. So this is the 100% CuPc case, just using it as a sort of a benchmark. And you have to consider the interaction between one of these spin electrons one of these electrons on the d orbitals interacting with, say, the third or next nearest neighbor interactions. So that's what we want to measure for these. And so what I'm defining here is a single high spin state, and then we have multiple low spin states here. And we have to remember that also that these are finite systems. They're only defined for finite systems, so any calculation of the j's happens within a finite system here. So I'm actually just calculating for CuPcs in this case, and then looking at the interaction. So polynuclear case is essentially superposition of dimers for these. So we're looking at energy differences between the states as the dimer interaction between all of the other unflipped spins with those. And that's where we get these J's values here, where the subscripts correspond to the electron site position. So 1 would correspond to the first one, and 4 would correspond to the last position. Alright, so that's an overview of all of the theory that I'm going to be looking at here. So now I want to just quickly flash up the computational details for these, and this is what I did. The main feature that I want to focus on is I did this with quantum espresso and the plane wave basis set, and with these PBA, GGA functionals. So PBE, GGA functionals. If you have any questions about other details of this, I'd be happy to go over them later. Alright, so now I'm going to get into the results of these. So the first thing that I want to look at is the molecular structure for these. It's a good entrance into determining whether or not the level of theory that I'm using is correct on the lowest level. So looking at the molecular structure for these, what I have here is this copper-phthalocyanine. And so my calculated values here in angstroms are on the top and the experimental values on the bottom. What we see here is that my calculated values correspond fairly well to the experimental values. And so what I'm using from this is, for all of my other 1D systems that I'm going to be calculating for, I'm using this this structure here, and then I'm going to be stacking these on top of each, or stacking these in these 1D chains. So I consider the molecular structure fixed in these cases. Now, when I want to look at the 1D chains of these, and starting to look at these, we know that these are organic molecules, and the interaction between them might not always be very local interactions. So in order to describe them, DFT is a fairly local method of calculation. So we have to add in a little bit of, or sorry, not a little bit, but an approximation to allow us to get more binding from the dispersion effects from this. So, like I said before, so what I'm doing is I have these 1D chains in different dilute systems, and I want to calculate now the planar distance between these. So I've calculated a single molecule, put those in, and now I want to just sort of optimize it, see what the planar distance should be for these. And that's what I'm doing here. So these structures on the sides, these describe the different systems that I have, where the arrows correspond to the spins on the copper atoms, and the zeros correspond to the metal-free system. So you can see here the metal-free is interspersed between these copper systems. And the dispersion correction that I was talking about is a Leonard-Jones correction. This S6 parameter here is functional dependent, and these C6 parameters here are the coefficients that you would get between interactions between the I and Jth atoms. And this damping term here that allows us when the Rij, so that's the distance between our atoms here, when that gets very small, we use this damping term here to prevent singularities. Where this R sub small r here is the sum of the atomic van der Waals radii for these systems. So the results here show that it's about 3.24 in the copper system, growing slightly to 3.26 angstroms for this system. So as we add more H2Pc, it's very, very slightly increases the planar distance between them. And that in some part of them, comparing to experimental results, we saw earlier that from one of the first slides for the structure, they predicted the structure of these copper-phthalocyanines to be 3.26, but in literature you get a fairly a decent range of values. Some theoretical calculations focus on 3.42, or and some look at 3.6 for the planar distance between copper-phthalocyanines. So it falls within a range of spectrums. But what I want to look at next is why I want to apply this dispersion correction to these systems. And this is just to give you an example of why we need this dispersion correction, because initially calculating without the dispersion correction, you get first a very shallow optimization curve. We have the energy versus the planar distance here. It's very shallow without this dispersion correction. And actually, it comes out to about 4.1, between 4 and 4.1 for an optimized planar distance, which is considerably larger than anything that's reported, and then it's also you have less interactions between those. So any electronic properties that you calculate without the dispersion correction are essentially useless in that case. And this dispersion correction is shown here on this bottom, where you get a larger interaction, shown by the shallowness of compared to the shallowness of these curves, and then the optimization parameter there. So what I also talked about earlier is calculating these Hubbard U values. So go through each of these diluted systems where we have these 1 and 2 configurations. So we have different environments and calculating these Hubbard U's. So what I went through, doing that, you can calculate essentially the change in energy, the change in occupation for these values to calculate U self-consistently. So some other results looking at the U would be done. You could compare them to experimental values like band gap or something like that. So you get the U's. What I've done here is this fully self-consistent procedure to calculate the U's. You know, I find it's about 6.16 to 6.11 to 6.16 EVs range for the value of U on these copper orbit, or the copper D orbitals here. In the interest of time, I want to move on to looking at the exchange constants. So once the values of U were calculated, now I can go through and calculate the exchange constants by using this polynuclear extension of the broken symmetry model. So what I'm showing here is these exchange constants in Kelvin. So the energy scales for these first are very, very, very small compared to an EV. As well as we see these sign changes here, where we have nearest neighbor interactions are negative, so that means that we have antiferromagnetic interactions, and next nearest neighbor are positive. So we have these antiferromagnetic ground state prediction from these J values here. And what we see when we dilute it with H2Pc is, as we get further away, these the further neighbors, so 1,4 corresponding to 3 mole-phthalocyanine away, it drops off dramatically. You get orders of magnitude lower as we get further away. So the strength of interaction is mostly retained in nearest neighbor interactions and possibly next nearest neighbor interactions. So now I've gone through and looked at calculating these Hubbard U's, the exchange constants. Now I can look at the electronic structure. And the first thing I want to look at is the UPS, and that's the ultraviolet photoelectron spectra for these. And what the UPS comes from is, experimentally, it comes from gas phase. And what that means is that they look at these molecules. So these results correspond to a single molecule. In this case, it might correspond to a single copper-phthalocyanine on the left-hand side here, and a single metal-free phthalocyanine. Note that I also, it's another time, 6.16 EVs, as I reported earlier for these. What these are meant to show is the difference between the ligand states that you might see from the H2Pc. You compare that to here the copper-phthalocyanine states. And these dotted lines here are the Fermi energies for these systems. So what we see is, what to notice is to draw this back to the beginning here, and these states here. Sorry, it's a little bit to see, but I think it'll be a little bit more clear later what these are. But so what I initially said is that PBE-GGA does not resolve what these states are. And what we see here is these states are resolved for when you start to include these Hubbard interactions in between those. And what I mean by resolved here is we have this single spin-up state, this predominantly spin-up state at this point here. And then we have slightly to the right of that, we have a fully spin up and spin down. So this fully occupied state to the left of that. So the ordering that we have there is the lower energy state is the partially occupied d orbital of the copper, followed by a fully occupied state that we can use on the H2Pc. We can identify that as this state right here, right next to the Fermi energy there. as the ligand state. So the ligand state, the A1U symmetry we saw before, where you have interactions within the ligand, and then this B1G state here, which is interactions of the d orbital with the ligand. So just to show a little bit clearer how these Hubbard U values change the interaction here. So this is just a range of U values for this. You can't see this, so what I'm going to do is sort of enlarge this little area right here. So all of these are shifted such that the Fermi energy is at 0 for these cases. So you can just sort of focus on this energy range right there. So we're looking at this, we have 0 line here. And what I'm indicating, so this is the U equals 0 case, and this is the U equals 7 EV case here. So it's just the same range. So we're going from no Hubbard interaction to fairly a little bit higher than predicted Hubbard interaction here. And what I've denoted by these lines here are the peaks that are occurring in these B1G or partially occupied d orbital states. So the peak without the Hubbard interaction aligns basically with these ligand state here. So they're unresolved. You cannot tell the difference between them. As you increase the U, they slowly separate throughout this range here. So it's the addition of these U interactions that causes the separation of these states. So now looking at the density of states. So now moving from a molecular system into a crystalline system. So looking at these density of states, what I've presented here are the density of states for the CuPc case here, as well as the density of states for the H2Pc case. So just sort of the same UPS comparison where you can tell these states due to the ligand here, and right here for the CuPc, and then we have this extra state here for the due to the d orbitals on the CuPc. Now, I also want to point out that these are all of these spin up. The density states and positive values are positive spin, and these negative values here are spin down. So we only have we don't have the difference, the spin resolved density of states for the H2Pc. It's just the addition of these two values. So now, how can we look at exactly what these d orbitals are doing within the density of states in sort of these samples? So first thing that I want to look at is, so this is just the pure CuPc case, and understanding where these d orbitals are falling. And so we see here we have these peaks. The low Fermi energy again is denoted by the dotted line here. So we have these peaks here, and correspond to this peak, as well as some core states that correspond to the peaks within this range here. And we want to resolve these and see how these change based on their environment due to dilution. So looking at this is the same d orbital picture, density of states for the d orbital picture that was shown in the last slide. But now we can sort of we can pull out the in-plane states and just understand what these B1G interactions are, so we can clearly see that the interactions within the plane here, this dxy orbital, are the predominantly this feature here, as well as a few core features of lower energy. But when you're looking at interactions between phthalocyanines, you want to look at out-of-plane interactions. So what I can show here is these zy orbitals. So these are out-of-plane interactions, and they largely correspond to these core states here. So lower down, about 8 EVs, there's about right here somewhere, interactions with these. Now all of the, I'm just choosing one of these out-of-plane states here as an example, just to give an overview of these, where all of the other ones do contribute to this as well. So now we can look at, we want to see this energy range here, and how does this change based on our diluted samples. So we can look at the different environments that these systems might be in. So now I placed it in 3 environments, where you have this completely CuPc case. You have an environment where you have CuPc on one side, H2Pc on the other, and you have an environment where you have H2Pc on either side. So what do we see here? We see that these contributions, it's the interactions supposedly causing these different density of states for these out-of-plane orbitals. And this comes back to what the original outlook of this project was. We want to understand these interactions due to the dilute systems that are caused by a difference in environment. And so what we see here is this fairly large difference in the density of states. All right, so now I just want to close. So I think, you know, in a way, the goal has been achieved. That we've observed these differences in density of states due to different environments. And so H2Pc, diluting with a metal-free variant, it gives you a good benchmark, a good basis for understanding that these interactions do occur for these systems. But if you were to say look at manganese PC diluting with other more interesting, more different phthalocyanines, you might get more richer interactions in the d orbitals, and different types of spin interactions as well that you could observe. So just what I'm calculating, or just recapping what I've gone through here is looking at structure optimization of the molecule one chain, calculating Hubbard U exchange constants, and then finally ending up with the electronic structure. I just want to say thank you to my advisor, Mr. Maestro here. A few graduate students throughout the years, Max, Lane, and Naveen, especially for very good conversations about these phthalocyanine systems, Department of Physics, for funding me throughout this whole process. And then just the VAC and EXIC here for computational resources. And thank you for everybody else on the committee for bearing with me, reading my thesis and giving comments on that. So just thank you very much.
Well, two related questions. So when you introduced you said that generically speaking, without the Hubbard U, the system is a metal, right? So when you introduce the Hubbard U,
okay, so I use that as not the elementary case, but it is the case for understanding or motivating why Hubbard U has been given is not insulator. So that's what I was referring to when I said it was a metal. So in DFT describes Mott insulators as a metal, whereas when you include DFT with the U correction to it, it describes it as an insulator.
Right. So I guess my question was, so what tells you it becomes an insulator when you change the U? If you put U to 0, would you have a metal? Within the
if you consider no like on-site Coulomb interactions, you'll have just this in the case of U equals 0. You just have this hopping term. Are we talking about Mott insulators or phthalocyanines in this case?
About phthalocyanine. Yeah, okay, so I guess we should make a distinction, right? Yeah. Phthalocyanine is a finite system, which I guess is always an insulator, right? Am I right? Or no?
It's
okay, so
it's an organic semiconductor in a way. It's certainly not a metal.
Within the calculational scheme, if you take this phthalocyanine, which is a finite system, and you don't introduce the U, then is it an insulator? And does it describe well the structure?
It's not a conductor.
So it's an insulator. So it's in between. So the semiconductor. Well, yeah. So you don't need. So that is the Hubbard you needed to describe the some property of the phthalocyanine related to its finite size spectrum. Apart from I'm asking because I want to know. So apart from the magnetism, does one need the Hubbard U to fit the finite size spaghetti in the phthalocyanine?
It resolves the states. You're looking at, like you showed in the,
in the Hubbard U, it's about 6 electron volts, right?
Yes.
So which is not small, I mean, it's about what it always is.
So if we change the U values for these, we can resolve these different states here at the, essentially the valence states for them. You end up with these single electron d orbitals which are lower in energy than the fully occupied ligand orbitals. So it's required for this. That's what this U does. It's fundamentally electronic.
So if you switch off the U, something horrible will, the spectrum will not be right.
Correct.
Is it correct? Yeah, correct. So then the second question in relation to the insulating products. So in the final slide with the density of states, there was the dotted line is the Fermi energy.
Yes.
Yeah? So all these states most of them are below the Fermi energy. So they.
I'm only talking about states below. I'm only talking about occupied states.
Right. So these are. Is this a gap? I mean, in the spectrum, it doesn't make sense to talk in that. It's a finite size system, right?
No. So I'm looking at 1D periodic systems. Calculating the J's, that's strictly a periodic. It's strictly a finite system. You need finite systems to calculate those J's. That's just the way that the model is designed for. Look at it. You can look at UPS in the single molecule, but for density of states, these are periodic in 1D chains.
Right. So in other words, my understanding is incredibly primitive. So below the -2, is it a band of states or it's a gap, roughly speaking?
No. Right. So it predicts that there's going to be no states. Okay. So there's no states in this energy range.
Right. So these are gaps, and after that, when there are peaks, there is some kind of spaghetti there.
Yes.
Is it correct?
Yes.
Okay. So this is, wouldn't we call this an insulator? There is nothing on the Fermi energy. Below that, there is a gap of 2.2 electron volts. Am I reading it wrong?
Yeah. It's not a conductor. It's somewhere in
I
there.
have
Okay.
a little bit here. So this is the d orbital density of states, correct?
So this is the d orbital density of states.
I'm looking at the
inside.
total.
And
Okay,
this is
that's
the-
the total.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Now, how do you connect that to the UPS picture you showed before, where you had these broad peaks?
Okay.
Because I think that's what he's kind of.
Well, I just wanted to know if it's a kind of an insulator, and I think the total DOS picture. So, I mean, it is the full self-consistent calculation.
Yeah, so the reason why there are broad peaks in the UPS is largely to correspond to experimental data, which also give broad peaks. The way that I calculate these UPS is I calculate eigenvalues for these. So I have peaks at these eigenvalues, but I use Gaussian broadening to compare it to experimental values.
Thank you.
More question?
The committee gets to ask questions separately, or?
Yes.
Okay.
It's really separate. Yeah.
So, carrying the discussion forward, the J coupling that you showed, that you were getting different values. Yeah. So, in this system, so you always had just 4 molecules, right? Is that what you said?
Yes.
So, in the case where you have 2 of copper and then 2 of H2Pc, how does that relate to the J of nearest neighbor? Because the J is always between the spin. Is that what we're looking at, right?
Yes.
So if you have 2 spins and then 2 molecules that don't have spins, how does that make sense in that picture?
How does it make sense? In calculating, it's a difference in environment. I guess that's the reason why I want to calculate that system in particular is you have a difference in environment. On one side you have CuPc, the other side you have H2Pc. And then if it was, say, 3 CuPcs, see if the exchange coupling between nearest neighbors would be different due to the environment.
Right. Because I was trying to relate it to...
Even simpler. There is no J12 in this dynamic because there's always an H2Pc between them.
In between them.
So that coupling doesn't even exist. That's why it's black.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to make
sorry.
sure that
Okay, yeah.
the H2Pc always goes in between them, right?
Yeah.
Because the way you had represented them, you had like 2 spins and then 2.
Oh yeah, so that was just an example for it. But yeah, so the gaps here because they don't exist. Yeah, sorry.
More questions? No more questions?